Oh, hello again. Today is April 7th. Wow. Anyway, so today we're going to talk about graphing the secant function. And if you recall, secant is the reciprocal of cosine. Now, one of the things I realized I didn't talk about yesterday when I was looking at when we did the cosecant stuff was I wanted to remind you when you're looking at a secant graph stems from the cosine graph. And a cosine graph starts at the a value, 0, opposite a, 0, back to the a value. So now when you start thinking about the idea of where the zeros are going to be located for where your asymptotes are going to be, it's going to be at the 2 points that share the same horizontal line after we do all of our shifting. Okay. Yesterday with the sine graph, it was different because what we did was we had zeros, a, 0, opposite a, 0. When it did this, it hit the 0 line 3 times. That's why we had the 3 asymptotes. Whereas the cosine, or excuse me, the secant function will only have 2. Okay? So we'll do the same idea. We started out the same way like we did before. We're going to rewrite, pull out the half, and we get 2 secant 1/2 theta minus, well, if I'm going to have to multiply this in by 1/2 to get a fourth, that means the numerator needs a 2. So this becomes just pi over 2 minus 1. Okay? So let's see here. We have an a value of 2, a b value of 1/2, an h value of pi over 2, and a k value of -1. So that means we'll have our regular parent and our shift. Remember, we're talking about the shift here is going to be just of a cosine to start with, and then we'll worry about the asymptotes and stuff from there. So our shift is going to be x plus the pi over 2 and y minus 1. Okay? So we'll over-exaggerate our lines to the right a little bit because we're going to have to move things over towards the right some. Our period, this is another pretty simple one. We know it's 2 pi over 1/2. So we're going to get 4 pi for our period. All right, we'll draw our line here. Move this up just a hair and do so. Okay, so let's just place our 4 pi here. Halfway is 2 pi, halfway is pi, and then in the middle, between those two, will be our 3 pi. Our a value is 2. Since this is a cosine graph, our first step is always to start at a, 0, opposite of a, 0, and a. That gives us our generic parent function prior to the shift. List them. So we are at 0, 2, pi, 0, 2 pi, -2, 3 pi, 0, and 4 pi, 2. So our shifting, we get pi over 2, and 2 minus 1 is 1. This becomes 3 pi over 2, and -1. This becomes 5 pi over 2, -3. This is 7 pi over 2, and -1. And lastly, that's 8 pi over 4, so it becomes, why am I blanking here? 9 pi over 2, sorry. Hello. And we're back at 1. So the points that we have to pay attention to now is these guys were our zeros, which meant that when they get shifted, those two become my zeros. So we go ahead and plot them. We know now that our graph moved over, but it only moved over pi over 2. So we can put breaks in between all of these. And then we have our points. So 9 pi over 2, 7 pi over 2, 5 pi over 2, 3 pi over 2, and pi over 2. We now have a lower value of -3, and we just go through the process again. So at pi over 2, we're at 1. 3 pi over 2, we are at -1, -3, -1, and back up to 1. Now again, you'll notice my 0 line occurred here, just like we anticipated, a -1 and our -1. So when we go to connect our values here, see if I can draw this without messing everything up. These zeros become the vertical asymptotes. Okay. Now, what's weird with the with the secant graph is that you're only going to get one either dip, or if it was inverted with an a value being negative, it could have been up this way. You really only have one curve that you can blow up, if you will. So we know it's got to dive this way and this way. And then this one's going to work up towards your asymptote, and this one's also going to work up towards your asymptote. These graphs look really cool, I always thought, but I just wanted to give you the idea of what this one should look like. So hopefully, just remember, the main idea here is when you have a cosine graph, it has two zeros. So then that means a secant graph will have two asymptotes. When you have a sine graph, it has three spots that are zeros, which means the cosecant graph has three asymptotes. Once again, I have two problems on the formative site, and hopefully that thing's still chugging along. I know on Friday it was down, it was going up, it was down, whatever, in there. But do me a favor, if you do ever get a question on formative and you type in it on formative, it doesn't alert me that you had a question, so shoot me an email so that way I know to go look at it real quick, and we'll continue on. So thanks, guys. Make sure you're all staying healthy, and we'll talk to you tomorrow.